Hammurabi, Sargon also. Back when empire building was looked on as being a virtue, Cyrus the Great was one of the biggest empire builders of all time, but at home he was henpecked by his wife. His wife said, hey, you have a duty and obligation to go out and conquer. You can bring about world peace if you can get these people under control. So he conquered. We'll talk more about him when we come to Persians later on in the chapter. All right, I'm going to move on to Egypt. All right, Egypt is the Nile River. Without the Nile River, there'd be no Egypt. The Nile River flows right smack through the Sahara Desert. Now, this has changed. When I was in school, they would tell us that the average rainfall in that part of the world was about one thunderstorm every 60 years, maybe a thunderstorm in 100 years. But that area is starting to get more unusual weather, just like a lot of the rest of us. And they're starting to have some weather there. But anyway, the Nile River, at one time, the Nile River, every spring, would overflow its banks. Now, it wasn't because they had rain. What caused the Nile overflow its banks was because they had rain way down in Lake Victoria where the Nile starts. And the spring rains that would hit the Lake Victoria would raise the water level of the Nile. The Nile would flow down, overflow its banks, and put out a fresh layer of topsoil. When the flooding was over, the Egyptians would go in with a fresh layer of topsoil and grow their crops. That way they did not have to practice crop rotation, did not have to worry about the soil being depleted. They got a fresh layer. Now today, in modern times, they don't like all that flooding, so they've dammed up the Nile River with a big dam, and it has stopped the flooding. And they water their crops by irrigation now, more so than they once did. But at one time, the Nile River would give them a fresh layer of soil. And they still had to water their crops. And some of their pumps that they use are said to be 1,000 years old. They'd use foot pumps that they'd pump them like we pedal a bicycle and pump the water by means of foot pumps up to their crops and keep their crops watered that way. The Nile River flows north, but the wind blows south. So if a person on a boat wanted to go north on the Nile River, he'd just put his sail down, and the boat would float north. If he wanted to go south, he would put his sail up, and the wind would push him south. So that way it seemed like to the Egyptians that the land of Egypt was a perfect place. In fact, they believed that when the gods made the world, they made Egypt first. And then they made the rest of the world. But Egypt was perfect because it was the first place built. And then the rest of the world was less and less than perfect. Now, the Nile River flows along and it eventually empties into the Mediterranean. This is the Nile Delta. Now, in modern times, you look at the map, the Nile Delta only consists of 2 little branches. But at one time, every time there was a flood, which happened every year, the Nile River these branches would change. The Egyptians hated this area because they would wake up and find that their land might now be underwater permanently, or their house might have been carried away by a flood, and they'd have to argue with their neighbors on which land was theirs and which land wasn't, because the landscape was permanently changed, and they just said, we're not going to live in an area like that. So they wound up giving it to the Jews when the Jews moved in, which I will talk about in a little bit. The Egyptians were ruled by Pharaoh. Now that might be an AO. Anyway, they were ruled by Pharaoh. Unlike the Sumerian rulers who didn't, the Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be a god. And they believed that all the other pharaohs had become gods when they died, but they also were God when they were alive. And this might help to explain why that they, well, two things, why they maintained a completely separate existence from everybody else in their country, and also why they were very, very, very stubborn as far as not wanting to change the laws that they made. Pharaoh, he was God, at least in the eyes of the Egyptians, inaccessible to the general public, and ruled as he pleased, even though some people believe that the land of Egypt was a land of slavery, to where even the Pharaoh himself was really just a glorified slave. If you ever read the book 1984, where that everything was controlled and everybody was controlled from birth, and nobody had any freedom at all, yet they were made to think they had freedom, Pharaoh might have been the same way. Now, the Egyptians under the Pharaoh had a caste of people we sometimes call priests. You might call them scribes. The word scribe means educated person. They looked on these people, though, as being their scientists. We would think of them perhaps as being their theologians or their historians, their record keepers. The ancient peoples, and folk, this is extremely important to understand the mindset of the ancients. They didn't know the difference between religion, science, and politics. They never had a conflict between the three. Now, in a modern world, we had a politician was asked one time, well, what do you believe about abortion? He said, well, religiously, I believe it's wrong, but politically, I believe it's okay. I think that sounds kind of schizophrenic, but anyway. But they never had this kind of conflict. Of course, the conflict between science and Christianity is well known. And I'll be talking more about that during the semester. Particularly, science seems to tell us the earth is billions of years old. The religious books seem to give a different picture. Both the Bible and the Quran give a different picture. Was man created or did man evolve? Again, that's the part of the conflict between science and theology. Other conflicts also. But they didn't have any such conflict in those days. So what we might call priests, or might even call scribes, they thought of them as being, they kept the records. Now, because they controlled all the education, it looks like they took liberties from keeping history. For instance, when they kept history, they distorted it greatly. Particularly, they distorted it to make it look like they were the oldest people on the face of the earth, that Egypt was around first. So how'd they add years, you might ask? Okay, let's take an example. In our country's history, we had a case that we once had two presidents at once. Their names were Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. If you changed the history a little bit and gave Lincoln 4 years and Jefferson Davis 4 years, you've added 4 years to history. If you put them end to end instead of simultaneous. It's known that the Egyptians did just that. But then if you take all the governors of every state that we've ever had and add them end to end, you can make our country's history appear to be 3,000 or 4,000 years old. Not that it actually is, but you could alter it. Now, the Hebrews couldn't have had that happen to them because their history is written in a book and taught by everyone, just like I'm trying to teach you. So hopefully that could not happen to us today. But the Egyptian scribes controlled the teaching of history, and it is known that they altered history in such a way as to make themselves look like they were the oldest people that had ever lived, that Egypt was the land that was made first. All right.